Hi, I'm Marissa, and today I'm going to be presenting this work of art to you. Now, this is an oil, water-based, and crayon work that's currently on display in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Before that, it was acquired from the MoMA, and this work of art is one of the best-known neoclassical pieces of the artist Pablo Picasso. And while perhaps it's not as famed as some of his more abstract and more colorful pieces, or even the famous Guernica, this piece is interesting in that it doesn't have that same drastic shape and color that his other works are famed for. Before I tell you a bit more about this painting, let's consider what we can see just from looking at it. Now, there's not much color, only the whites and the neutrals, which make it a fairly monochromatic work. And perhaps this was done to make the portrait appear softer, maybe to make her seem and look more feminine. But there is a clear shadow behind her, so the light source is obviously shining on her face and catching certain parts of her in the light that Picasso likely wanted to highlight, like the top of her cheekbones and her nose and the forward part of her dress. Now, her dress does have texture, and her body also has texture, but the dress crinkles and it folds as it moves down her shape, as well as when it moves out of the painting. Her hair has a texture too, in the way that it curls and moves down her back. And all these lines are softer. Her shape almost even looks blurred around the edges, probably again alluding to that same beauty and that delicateness. There's not a ton of depth or volume. She really just seems to exist on her own within the work, which is making it a portrait piece, and that there's not much in the background to distract from her image. Now, on a more contextual level, this piece of art was created when Pablo and his wife returned from vacationing in the southern part of France. Many believe that this work was created in the image of a woman named Sarah Murphy, who was an American. Others believe it was created in the image of his wife Olga, who he has depicted before. He actually has another work of her that's currently being featured in the Met as well. The Met is home to several other of Picasso's works as well, such as The Dreamer, which was created in 1932, and Reading at a Table, which was created in 1934. Now, both of these pieces are a lot more vivid and colorful than The Woman in White, which was created in 1923. Now, Picasso's earlier works in the earlier 1900s were a lot more simplistic, and as he developed in his style, they became a lot more like the works people associate with him. If we decide that this painting is to be a depiction of Sarah Murphy, then we know a couple things about her. We do know that she was part of the Lost Generation, which is referring to Paris in the 1920s, a group of expatriate American artists, musicians, and singers who made their way to the French capital during this time, as well as other parts of the French Riviera. We do know that Pablo Picasso was friends with Sarah Murphy's husband, who also resided in the French Riviera, and we know that there's a strong association between Pablo Picasso and the Lost Generation. Whether or not he influenced them or they influenced him, a lot of his artwork is associated with this specific period in Paris, France. So now that we know a little bit more about the context behind the piece, maybe that changes the way we interpret it. So when we look at this woman and we look at the emotion on her face, maybe we feel differently now knowing that this is someone Picasso knew personally. She wasn't just a stranger or someone he met for just a day. This is a woman he likely had a relationship with, whether it be a friend or his wife. Either way, that probably influenced the way he depicted her. That probably influenced the colors he used and the way he depicted her as more soft and more innocent. Now, as mentioned earlier, this is one of several portraits during Picasso's neoclassical period. I would argue that, to me, I interpret this as more of a revival of classic, antique-style art, which is likely because Picasso spent so much time in both Italy and in France. And again, now that we know a bit more about the context, maybe the way we look at this picture is a little bit different this time as well. Earlier I mentioned that there wasn't a ton of depth, but now if you look more closely at the face, you can see sort of a life behind her eyes. This woman is very much a depiction of a classic beauty, which I think Pablo Picasso is aiming for here. Now that we've considered the painting just as a basic first glance and we've thought a bit more about the context behind it, maybe we can really start to move towards why Picasso would create a work of art in this manner. While the history and time period may not always be incredibly relevant to a work of art, I think here it's important to consider that the world is coming out of World War I, and Picasso and many other artists are trying to deal with that on a sort of emotional and mental level. This return to a more antique, classic style type of artwork and classic style type of beauty is refreshing in a way. To be quite honest, when I first saw this painting at the Met, I didn't think it was one of Picasso's, and if it weren't for his signature on the artwork, I may never have assumed it or thought it to be one of his, simply because the style and the color is so different from what is largely associated with him as an artist. So when considering what's actually going on in this picture and why we've interpreted it that way, One thing to start with is the woman's emotion and how her face reads. Some have suggested that because her arms are crossed, she's in a state of tension, and others have suggested that she's simply relaxing in her chair. And it's hard to really interpret that one way or another, and there's no incorrect answer because Picasso never divulged on what his specific intentions for this painting were. Personally, I've interpreted the painting to be more so of the latter, that the woman is simply relaxing in her chair, and I think her body language kind of implies this. Her fingers aren't pressed too tightly against her arm, and her arms aren't too tightly crossed, and there's no tension in her brow. I think that she's simply sitting there just to sit there. I don't think that there's a deeper sort of angry or tense emotion behind that. So in reflection, as we've interpreted this painting, we've learned a lot about it. We started off just looking at a formal analysis of face value and then diving deeper into the context and the history surrounding it. We've even tried to decipher who the image may be it of Sarah Murphy or his wife Olga. I think either way we've been able to learn a lot about this woman in general. We've also been able to sort of reflect on Picasso's work here. Most of his artwork is composed of bolder lines and harsher shapes, but this artwork is soft, it's subtle. He's used the textures of her dress to make her seem lovely, and he's used the soft blending around her face and around her body to make her seem softer, and that's a very interesting aspect of it as well. Woman in White is an important painting to interpret for several reasons. It stands out from a lot of Picasso's other works in that his earlier works were darker, and Guernica was a lot more horrific, and his later works are very tense despite them being so colorful. His portraits like Woman in White stand out because they're softer. They defy what people typically associate with Picasso as an artist. And I think it's important to look at that as an audience because you can see that the artist has a lot of diversity in what they do, and all of these paintings can be interpreted in different ways.